Welcome everyone to this week's episode of the 5710 podcast. This week's guest is Graham Robertson of Planned Delivery.
Hi.
Formerly of Lend-Lease, yes?
Yes, I used to be with Bovis, and then it became Lend-Lease. So
so the first question I want to ask you is, what's the outside perspective of architects? Because we spend so much time with each other, speaking amongst ourselves about architecture, and I think we become a bit self-involved. What's the someone that isn't an architect's perspective of the culture and the people, I suppose, as well, or is it varied?
Well, I'm a civil engineer by profession. I focus, my business is all about managing time and making sure the projects deliver on time, and probably a lot of people who aren't architects, their view in the industry of the architect is kind of the time element. This is where we're going to lose time because the architect's going to take longer to deliver a design that's then buildable, etc. So it's possibly a view of
contempt.
No, it's not contempt, but of people. I think people have to realise that we, as an industry, deliver buildings. It's a teamwork game to deliver a building to a client, and sometimes there's a perception that its aesthetic appearance is the sole domain of the architect. It's the thing that they're solely precious about, and the actual reality of how you deliver that is the bit that the nasty builder does. And I think the biggest problem is that the architect and other members of the team don't necessarily understand one another's approach to ultimately delivering a project. For the architect, it is about designing something that's practical and deliverable and aesthetically pleasing. To the builder, it's, I've got to build a building, the client wants it for X number of pounds and he wants it by Y time, and that's the bit that's important to them, and quite often the two don't understand the different pull from the different people.
And something that's come up a lot throughout these interviews is the importance of collaboration and trying to gain an understanding of contractors, and the difficulty it comes from, specifically from our side, is we're stuck in university speaking to each other. You know, the first time we meet contractors, the first time they need us to speak to them is out on site, and usually there's a sort of wall there between, because quite often the architects, especially on smaller schemes, are the project managers, and you can't just speak to them openly at times. So it's a hard thing to break, I would say, but it has come up a lot.
You end up with, especially, I mean, you hit the nail there with Neil, with the thing of where the architect's the contract administrator as well. Again, that puts I think an unnecessary pressure on the architect, because you're trying to then walk down a tightrope of whether you're doing something that is your side architecturally and whether or not it's damaging your position as the supposed impartial view sat between the contractor and the architect. And so that is incredibly difficult tightrope to walk along, and I think personally it's an unfair pressure on the architect. It shouldn't be there. There should always be a contract administrator that isn't the architect, because I don't see how you can fairly administer whether or not, in effect you're asking yourself, was I culpable in a delay on a project? Mm-hmm. And that's a very, very difficult thing to be able to, for anyone to sit and admit, actually, I did something wrong.
It's probably just a control issue. We like to be the boss. And let's go back to this university thing. We're 6 years and we're always in the owner of our own projects. We don't have a client. We make up these projects, and it's a cult. 6 years is a long time. You can ingrain quite a lot in that time, and it's a hard thing to break. When we had someone come in before that. A previous guest was talking about, he tried to bring contractors into the university system, and he said it struggled. It's because, especially there's a lot of builders, they don't go to university because they don't need to, and it's a hard wall to break, but at least we're talking about it, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing as well that in our industry, more and more projects are design and build.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going through a process of doing design to a stage that then the main contractor will come on, and basically they've agreed a sum of money to do the build to. The architect, the other engineers are probably novated then to them, and the boot's on the other foot, and then you're in a situation where the main contractor, quite rightly, is there trying to make a profit. That's what all businesses have to do. And so they may look at the design and say, well, that cladding panel's lovely, but it costs 5 times too much. We need to look at cheaper options to make sure we can still provide the design, the aesthetic, but at the same time make sure for their shareholders they deliver a profit. So the idea that, well, we try to bring contractors into talk, I think the more the different parties to a building contract talk with one another right throughout their learning and development, the better, because contractors don't understand necessarily what an architect does. Quite often both contractor and the architect don't understand what the building services people do within the building. And when you look at, like this building we're sat in now, when you look at the building services, it was probably about 35 to 40% of the value of this building. Now, you have to understand how all the pipes and wires work, what it does, how it controls heating, lighting, etc. And that's something that's really, really important to understand. And yet in our industry, there's a lot of people who don't even understand that.
That's interesting. Do you think in the state of the industry just now that contractors, do you feel they care about this environmental crisis that's going on? Or do you think it's the same as always where it's, because we're going through not an economic dip, should say, not quite a recession, or do you start to think they're becoming a bit more open-minded? Do you feel they care, or do you think it's just a job for them? Because so at the moment, the past few months, there's been a climate crisis from the RRBA, and it'd be interesting to know if other people are on board with that, even as just a feel rather than legislation like this. So more just, do you feel a contractor cares?
I think, at the end of it, I know from my time at Lend-Lease, we had people within the business there that really did, look at everything in terms of, waste management and control, making sure that we're building buildings that have, the right level of BREEAM status to them. That care is there. Ultimately, and I don't think the contractor is trying to make a buck at the idea of, I'll change this panel because it's, cheaper but not as efficient.
No, of course not. No.
I think there's always the specifications there to control people.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that you have to remember, I think, across all of the building industry is that, you've got on big projects, you'll have project management, people working for people like Lend-Lease, or as it is, now people like, the main contractors, the big main contractors. They've got guys and girls working in their businesses that have all, probably more than likely been to university, done a degree in some construction-related matter, and they understand, because they're educated the same as you guys, that the importance of making sure that the building is creates the right environment and doesn't damage the overall environment.
That's good to hear. That's good. Do you think the implementation of BIM in the past decade or previously, do you think it's made a real change, or has it caught up yet to the potential it promised when it first came out? Do you think we're at that point yet? Because you see these BIM models where everything can be done integrated, and it should, in theory, provide a seamless process where everything's super organised and everything is all in one place. Do you think we're caught up to the point where we can see it?
No.
Not yet. Do you think it'll happen, or is it just a matter of not yet?
This sounds terrible. It makes me sound like I'm about 95, but a lot of people came at the BIM perspective of, we can work in this wonderful project ether, where we can look in 3 dimensions at the project. We can add the specification and costing to it. We can add a time model to it, so that we can, in effect, build in 3D, in some sort of cyberspace that then will help the whole world deliver the project. I think the fundamental thing with all that is, whether we like it or not, actually how this room is put together is a guy or girl with a hammer, some nails, screwdriver. It's done in physical space, and we can hypothesize about what happens in a 3 or 4 dimensional model as much as we like, but the reality is that we still physically build things on site, and we need then to be able to print off drawings that are 2D, to give them to people, to pick them up, to use them, and whilst we have, some things have become more factory made, so some building services elements can be prefabricated, cladding panels to an extent can be prefabricated, but you still require people on site to put them together and create the project. And that, whether we have BIM, whether it's a good idea or not, ultimately it comes down to, we still need guys and girls on site to physically build this.
I certainly have found in my time of practice that we would be asked for a BIM model for a certain project, and we would provide, let's say, a half-arsed one. Do you think that happens quite a lot, where it's a tick in the box scenario, and in real life the contractors are just producing the drawings that they need?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I've got a project that I'm looking at the moment where there is the steel contractor. They're always quite good. They've put together a very detailed steel model. It's a 13-storey office block with a bit of a data centre in it as well. And the steel model sitting there in a 3-dimensional, whether or not it's true BIM is another thing, but it's in a 3-dimensional model. For me, that's quite helpful for my discipline, because I can then pick the model to bits and decide, okay, well, you need to build this bit first to open up that bit of cladding. So I can see it better in 3 dimensions in the model. There's pieces of software around where, once I've done the planning bit, you can link that to the 3-dimensional model, and it will build it for you in real time, in time. Mm-hmm. And you can, and that's quite a good way of communicating to people. One of the things that, I always say to clients, and we do a lot of training courses with clients, whenever you've produced a plan, how you're going to build a building, you've then got to communicate that to, it could be, if it's a big project, it could be 1,000 people working on site. They all need to understand the plan, and if a 3-dimensional model building helps them to understand how we want them to go and build the building, then fantastic. Because it's all about getting, 1,000 people to all do the thing you want them to do.
Something that we've talked about before in previous ones is that it's been about a decade or 2 since the invention of the computer as a mainstream thing, where people are growing up and being literate from a very young age. Are you starting to feel that with the next generation of people you're working with, of the younger members amongst the contractors or surveyors, that they're all quite confident with these sort of things of working on a computer? And do you feel a change, is what I'm saying, amongst?
I think the thing, Neil, that
with a confidence in viewing things like a BIM model, or
yes,
yeah.
There's people. I looked at I helped a contractor with a tender for a very, very complex build, part demolition, part new build, and one of the young engineers, I'd asked him to look at one particular area. He'd gone away that night and downloaded Google Earth map of that particular part of the building. He'd superimposed then the new build on it, done all that then in SketchUp, and added some information in SketchUp to it. Fantastic. It looked, really good. And obviously, clearly, he had some good technical experience to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. And it was a very helpful way of communicating what needed to happen. The only thing, again, and this sounds like I'm a bit of a Neanderthal, but The thing I often say to clients when people ask us about, which planning software should people use, and, should it be Primavera, should it be Power Project, should it be MS Project, and all the thing I always say to people is, in 1931, they built the Empire State Building in New York. It had, at that point in time, there were no computers. All the programming and planning was done on pieces of paper with a pen and a pencil. They started the design, it's 103 stories high, they started the design and they finished the entire building in 27 months. They built the building in 1 year and 45 days. They didn't need a piece of software, they didn't need a BIM model, they didn't need a laptop. They had a team of people who focused entirely on designing the building to make sure it could be built as quickly as physically possible. It wasn't a static design, they kept on changing there's like a huge antenna on the top of the building that dictates its height. They were trying to be the tallest building in North America, so there was a competition going on. And all this stuff happened with people thinking a lot, planning, that's where planning is, it's all done in your head, and then communicating it via drawings and sketches and helping everyone in the team understanding how to deliver the project. What we have to be very careful of going forward is we don't end up in a world where the laptop and doing something on a computer is perceived to be the best way of building it, when ultimately, whether we like it or not, we build things physically out on a greenfield or a brownfield site, and there are people there putting things together.
Whether they're hands or a crane or nuts and bolts, yeah.
And you don't create that in a laptop, you physically create the building or the project out in that environment. And so we need to be very careful that we don't head on into this IT super world and in actual fact forget the reality is that we build buildings out in the real world.
I would say there's definitely a tension at the moment amongst certainly the architectural community between that of, in your earlier years at university you're taught all these skills that are useful in professional practice because that's how the way of things done, and as you get into the later years you're part two, you're encouraged to stay away from them. The tutors are much more interested in looking at a sketch or a model compared to a computer image drawing, and it's really difficult to break the habit because it's just the way things are done. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Okay, final question of the day, and it's one we ask all our visitors. Do you have any recommendations for a grand tour? I understand you're not an architect, but you feel you must have an interest in even just a place that maybe off the beaten track perhaps a little bit, or somewhere that you find there's a building or a structure or something that you think people should really visit.
Wow, what a question. Well, the Empire State Building, just from the fact that it's incredibly clever the way they actually built it. I was involved with the Scottish Parliament building, so I did quite a lot of work with Enric Miralles before he died. I still love the building. I know it's controversial, some people hate it, some people love it.
I would say it's hard. I would say most students quite like it, most people I know like it, but they understand that it's quite hard to communicate to an average person what it is, because it is quite a complex building to look at. It's very different from every side, and
yeah.
I think people like to see something they can understand, a simple form or an object. And
there's bits in it, and I think from being involved in it, there's bits in it that you, from talking to Enric, and I was fortunate enough to do that a lot, and he would encourage you to look out of windows as you walked up staircases, to look out of windows that you wouldn't normally bother to look out of, and out of every window, as you just said, you'd see something different. So that to me is partly because I was involved in it, but it's a building that I think is stunning. I've always loved tall buildings, simply because I know from my discipline how complex it is to build tall buildings. And so things like, I've just been involved with 22 Bishopsgate down in London, which will be the tallest building within the square mile. And again, just standing at the bottom of the building and looking up, to me is, wow, you have to think, how did you actually build that? It's one thing to draw it, but another thing to think about, how do you pick up 5-ton steel beam from the ground and lift it up 70 stories and put it into the building, and then put a piece of cladding to that. And that thing, to me, again, it's just actually the bit that all got me into construction in the first place. How do you build that? It's one thing to draw it,
interesting.
but how do you actually build it is the bit that I still sadly find very exciting.
I would say, I wouldn't say I totally feel the same way as you do. I remember I see the Burj Khalifa, I just had a blow at the fountains, and I was just like unbothered by it. You know, it's kind of so tall and unrelatable at times. You know, that's what I find. But maybe that's each their own. Yeah, but it's interesting you say that. But
to me, it is. It's how did you build? How do you build that? How do you make that the architect's model? Because with Enric, for example, he didn't design by doing drawings. He did models. Everything started off as a sketch on his. He had a pad full of tracing paper, and everything was sketched on tracing paper. Then the model makers made models for him, and then he would look at the model and pick it up and turn it round. And there was one meeting I sat with him, and we were looking at the model of the MSP's offices, and he looked at the model and turned to the building services design engineer and said, "There's no way your services will fit in this gap." And so he took a scalpel and made the gap bigger, and then he gave the model to the structural engineer and said, "Okay, now you work out how it holds up." And for someone of that stature of architect to actually think about how the space for the building services would work, again, it's just, you've hit the nail on the head. You're thinking holistically rather than just by discipline.
Thank you, Graham, for joining us this week. Our next guest will be James Whittaker of Whittaker Studio, so make sure you tune in for that. Thank you.